It's not very well known, but there's actually like 12 stages of burnout. You can kind of talk a little bit about the leadership itself. Like what is the style of leadership?
People in tech, when they just enter, they just want the most competitive package. Welcome everyone to our Tech Minds Unwind series. My name is Vidhi and I work in tech in the Silicon Valley. In this episode, we are joined by Nicholas, who's worked at Google across marketing, partnerships, and people operations, and has now turned his attention to executive coaching and has co-founded something called as the Changing Work Collective. So overall, Nicholas has worn a ton of hats, and I'm very excited to have him here and begin with this conversation.
Thanks so much. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I think let's just get started with just walking us through the professional life and all the different hats that you've worn so far.
Oh boy, how long do we have for that? I have had a multitude of careers over the years. Everything that you just kind of broke down was really just like 10 years of my career. But before that, I had my own business for about 10 years as a video producer and a photographer, doing work for nonprofits, government agencies, NGOs, and other small businesses. And that's actually kind of what got me my foot in the door at Google originally. I was also a professor at a couple different universities in New York City for a few years. And then before that, I had multiple part-time jobs that I worked as I was bringing myself up out of poverty and getting myself paid through undergrad and grad school. So I've worked restaurants, I've worked video production, I've worked in the film industry, I've worked at a flight simulator on an aircraft carrier. I've had all kinds of random jobs over the years. But I think the thing that I'm most excited about is the work that I've been doing more recently, which is working with tech professionals who are struggling in unhealthy teams or hitting a career transition and needing to figure out their next steps. And then also building this collective and community called the Changing Work Collective, which I'm sure we can talk more about.
Oh my God, that's been a trajectory. How does it feel like rising through all of that and being here today?
It's always interesting because, looking back, it doesn't look like there was a plan necessarily. And I think that's very accurate. I think what I was doing for the longest time is I was chasing what felt right and following my intuition, lean into whatever my strengths were at any given time. So I've had an opportunity to sample a lot of different potential roles within tech and then outside of tech as well. And I just feel these days more aligned and kind of more passionate about what I'm doing than I feel like I've ever had in my entire life. So it feels great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Sounds very fulfilling.
Absolutely, yeah.
So how many tech professionals have you worked with so far, if you had to count?
Oh my gosh. Officially, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 24, but unofficially, probably closer to 100. I had, for years before I was actually working as a coach professionally, I was kind of the go-to for a lot of folks within my company and within kind of like my sphere of friends and people that I knew. So very casually, I was already working with folks, giving advice, giving mentorship. I'd spent a lot of time in particular working with folks that had just entered the tech industry who hadn't really had a lot of experience in that type of environment. Because what I found was that there just wasn't enough resources available and enough understanding and awareness available for those folks to really thrive in those environments. So eventually, around 2018, I finally decided, this probably is something I should be charging for instead of just offering it for free to everybody.
So what were the patterns that you noticed? Let's get deeper into the things that you mentioned for early career folks. What is it that the tech environment, is it that it's not suitable for them, or because there are no resources, they don't know how to cope with it, from student life to coming in here?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of all that. I think what I notice a lot are folks kind of getting into the industry at a very early stage, people that maybe had other careers or maybe just came out of the university and then getting into tech and just being kind of overwhelmed by the culture of those environments. There's a lot of kind of celebration and there's a lot of like bells and whistles and massage rooms and perks and free food and like all these other things that they get. The sense of connectedness and the sense of feeling of belonging is often missing there. It's all kind of surface level. When it really comes down to it, folks feel pretty isolated and they feel pretty alone in their experiences. And that often comes out in the form of imposter syndrome, which is a term that gets tossed around quite a bit. Or on the other side of it, what we start to see are people burning out and having mental health struggles or otherwise having a real hard difficulty of finding some sort of harmony with their work life and their outside of work life. A lot of these folks that would come to me after they had tried to go through employee assistance programs or therapy that was offered through work, or they had joined different ERPs or other types of groups that were designed ostensibly to support them, but weren't really finding the level of degree of care that they needed.
And how does one realize where they are on the spectrum? I mean, if someone someone is early career, then I guess imposter syndrome is like 100% given in the industry. But even after that, having spent like 2 or 3 years from having imposter syndrome to like mental health issues, not being able to cope, and then burnout. So how does one realize where they lie on that spectrum?
Well, I think it's different for everybody, but what I have noticed is that imposter syndrome is not unique to just people that just got started. I've talked to people that have worked at the companies that we're talking about in big tech, for example, or even startups. They've been working there for dozens of years and would still have the same feeling of imposter syndrome. And I think imposter syndrome is actually kind of a misnomer because it actually puts the responsibility on the individual as a syndrome, as if there's something wrong with them. But I think a better way of speaking about it is it's actually talking about a culture of imposterism. You don't necessarily have the sense of inclusion. You don't have that sense of belonging. And there's always this kind of competitive feeling where you're competing against your fellow employees or colleagues to be the best at whatever it is that you're doing, as opposed to being more of a collaborative environment and a supportive environment where all boats may rise. So that spectrum that you kind of mentioned, this difference between imposter syndrome and burnout, I actually see them as symptoms of the exact same issue. And it's a symptom of a culture and an environment that does not feel inclusive, and it does not take into account the needs of individuals over necessarily like the launch or the OKR or whatever the thing is that team is particularly like going for. And that then kind of goes on from there to other types of more somatic experiences. And that's something that I experienced quite a bit. Was I started noticing at first is gut health issues.
Yeah, I mean, that is so surprising when you mentioned gut health. There was no way in my head I was like trying to relate why stress would be with gut health. But then if you look at the science, it is.
Gut, the way, the research is going these days, they really kind of talk about it as the second brain. But even that, I think, is kind of a bit of a misleading statement because it's an interconnected system, right? You have your brain, you have your nervous system, you have your microbiome in your gut. There's nerves that go all the way from your gut all the way to your brain. And oftentimes when we're in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, or a reactive response due to a perceived threat in our environment, our entire nervous system lights up. And oftentimes the subtle signs that we notice of emotions or needs that aren't being met or identified shows up in our bodies. So it might show up as gut health issues, might show up as chronic pain. People tend to get migraines quite a bit. Or, and I'm sure that you've heard this before from folks, it shows up as the Sunday scaries, where like, Sunday comes around 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, suddenly they're waking up in a panic, worrying about work all of the time, and their ability to switch off work from non-work becomes very, very difficult.
And what about those that are like extremely burnt out? What do they experience? What have you seen?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's not very well known, but there's actually like 12 stages of burnout. And depending on where you're at on that spectrum of burnout, and we don't have time to go through all of 12 of them here, but actually I have a link on my website we can kind of link afterwards. It's called the 12 stages of burnout. And there's also 3 types of burnout, which also I think is really interesting. Most people don't assume that it's anything other than overwork. It's like, oh, I'm overworked, I'm burnt out because I just have too many responsibilities. But there's also 2 other flavors of burnout that are often misunderstood. One of those would be underwork or underwhelm, which is the other end of kind of this, what we call the window of tolerance. So, if you're overstimulated, you might freeze or be reactive. If you're understimulated, you also might have reactions to that as well. And then there's the third type, which actually is neglect. And a lot of times what happens is we end up with these complicated overlapping different types of burnout that are occurring, where maybe they're being overworked and they also have a manager that isn't really there for them and being supportive, or they don't have a feeling of a support network or a community that they can feel like they belong to. What I actually find to be interesting is not so much the extreme version of burnout, but the first sign of burnout and the first symptom of burnout. The first stage is usually overwork. So we try to overcompensate those feelings that we might have of not enoughness or feeling like we're falling behind in some way by working even harder. And what that does is it just perpetuates the cycle of burnout further and further and further. And if you get all the way down to the level 12 of burnout, that becomes a chronic clinical condition that actually needs medical care.
Basically, we kind of covered the entire spectrum, and that end sounds really, really scary. So, wish that on no one. But I guess we've discussed a lot of the problems. Let's jump into the solutions. What can people do to feel better throughout the spectrum? So, how do you help folks that are struggling with let's start with imposter syndrome.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think the techniques and the types of support that most folks need, whether they're experiencing burnout or imposter syndrome or a lack of a feeling of belonging or a poor career fit, it's actually kind of a lot of the same things. And it's not necessarily what you would think. I think a lot of folks would be like, oh, here's this easy button that I can push, or here's this like technique or this breathing exercise that I can do. And those things are great. And I totally support those. I'm a mindfulness and a meditation facilitator myself. I believe very strongly in the power of meditation and mindfulness. But to tell somebody, look, hey, it seems like you're burnt out. Why don't you take a day off and go for a walk in nature? That's not going to help in the long run, right? That's one or two solutions that, maybe might help the individual. But what I think we really need to look at are the systemic issues that are going on within organizations and within teams, and in particular, the types of leadership that are fostering environments where imposter syndrome or a lack of belonging or burnout even occur in the first place.
Gotcha. So this sounds like a highly customized plan, but I see how you said that all of this is sort of systemic and depends on leadership. So what would be some ways to identify for someone if it's not them, it's probably the way the entire company or maybe the leadership is making things happen for them?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest piece of this is conversations like this, honestly. So many folks that I talk to feel like their experience is unique and that they're alone. And it becomes this kind of shaming feeling where it's like, I'm suffering, I'm struggling, it must be something wrong with me. Therefore, I shouldn't talk to anybody about this because what if somebody finds out that I'm struggling? And what I really try to encourage people to do is, in the safest ways that they can, find peer groups, find communities of shared understanding. One of the things that I actually did at the last company that I worked at, we had mental health awareness discussion groups. And it was this open forum for people just to come to talk about what their mental health struggles are with no judgment, no advice given. It was just listening and being heard and being understood. And just that piece can radically shift someone's experience from going from a place of feeling alone and isolated to understanding that maybe there's something bigger going on here. So conversation, dialogue, transparency, wherever it feels safe. I think the other thing for folks to look at is, what is the relationship that management or leadership has with their reports or with their team? Is it a relationship that feels like a coaching relationship where they'll highlight their strengths, they'll highlight their virtues, and position them for opportunities that will help them flourish and help them grow? Are they maybe on the other side of things a micromanager? Are they preventing that person from having the autonomy that they need in order to be able to thrive? Are they a bully? Are they like, I have a client just recently that was telling me about their boss that yells at them regularly and blows up on calls, and they have to go to their skip level to like basically learn how to manage their manager because the manager has emotional dysregulation and a lack of emotional awareness and the impact that type of behavior is having. So that's more on the extreme side. But I think the other thing to look at is also peers. Like, notice how other folks within the company relate to one another. Is it a zero-sum game approach where people are stealing each other's work, they're taking credit for work that's been done, where they're maybe currying favor or otherwise trying to show up as like the favorite employee to the leader, or is it more of a collaborative approach that everyone is supporting each other and helping each other thrive over time? And these are things that you can find out at the very earliest stages of an interview of a job application. And we can get into that too if you're interested. We can talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think one of the things to really think about at the earliest stages is, as you're talking to hiring managers, to recruiters, and hopefully getting yourself access and availability with other people who have worked on those teams either previously or currently, is to talk and have questions of them about the culture. So it could be like, how is success celebrated? How is failure celebrated? What is the role of experimentation in this team? How often do we talk about well-being? What is actually being done about well-being or about the culture of the team? How many people have like left for like mental health leaves or otherwise like churned out of the company over the last few months or years? Like these are all kind of questions that can be really useful to get a little bit clearer about, what's the underlying conditions of the team beyond like the shiny PR blast or, the beanbag chairs and foosball tables that are kind of highlighted as part of the culture of an organization. Another thing that you can do too is you can kind of talk a little bit about the leadership itself. Like what is the style of leadership? Is it a dictatorial? Is it a coaching type of a style? Is it a hands-off type of approach? Does leadership change regularly? These can all be very powerful questions to get an idea of like, would this be a good fit in terms of the type of leadership that individual knows that they need to thrive and to flourish. These conversations can be sometimes difficult, and it can be hard necessarily to answer or ask those questions in an interview. But there's sites like Glassdoor, there's Reddit, there's all these different places that you can go. And what I actually encourage people to do is, like, if you're looking for a particular job at a particular company, do a little bit of research on LinkedIn, find out the other folks that might be on that team or in that organization, and try to get some time with them and just have a coffee chat or an informational conversation talking specifically about like, what is it like on a day-to-day basis to work there? What's the workload like? How often are you able to take time off? Basic questions to help give you a groundwork for, is this a type of team that I'd want to align myself with?
Yeah, no, all of these are great. I feel like I would do this for another job, like a second job that I'd be taking after a fresh grad. But as someone who's just graduated from school, I wouldn't even be able to think about all of this because I haven't experienced the culture. So this is like great insight. The other thing that I was thinking as you were mentioning all of this is usually what people in tech, when they just enter, they just want the most competitive package, the biggest startup so that they can become a millionaire. So all of these things like people don't even think about. So when someone lands into that space where they're already in there and now they're burning out, or they can't get out of that company anymore because they have other priorities, what do they do when they're still stuck in that environment and they have no choice to leave?
Yeah, well, hopefully they call me or other folks like me, because it's exactly the type of clients I love to work with. I think a lot of times what happens, and it happens with young graduates that are moving right into tech, and suddenly the shininess of that all of a sudden wears off, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is actually like way more than I thought it was going to be. Is every company like this? I hear this quite a bit. So there's those folks, but then there's also folks like myself. Like, I'm in my mid 40s right now. I had, as I mentioned earlier, many different careers before I worked in big tech. And I found myself several years into my career at big tech hitting this crossroads, or what I really call like a brick wall, where the techniques and the methods and the ways of being that I had exhibited up until that point no longer worked anymore. It was causing my body physical harm, and it was causing me a lot of heartache and a lot of mental fatigue and stress. So I felt stuck. I felt like I couldn't leave. I felt like I had no options. And it actually took me getting laid off to realize that there's like a big, huge world out here, and there's a lot of opportunities to bring my talents and skills to other organizations, or to even create something of my own. So I think the first thing that I would encourage people to do if they find themselves in a position where they feel stuck and they don't feel like that they have those options, get some perspective, whether that's working with a coach like myself or a mentor or a colleague that's a couple of steps ahead of them. Have conversations with people, learn a little bit about what options there are out there, and realize that, like, particularly if you're just starting out your career, this is a long game, right? It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. I had the fortune and the opportunity to kind of bring myself up through abject poverty, where I was actually living out of a car or living out of squat buildings, literally having to find, where my next meal would come from, instead of being able to like just have a bank balance and a retirement and all of these things. I started out at this very low level and moved my way all the way up to, where I was just before I got laid off, which was making multiple six figures. I had a savings account and a bank account and retirement and all of these feelings of security. But it wasn't until I had all of that and I had this apparent income and the sense of security that I felt literally the worst that I have ever felt in my entire life. And it made me realize that it doesn't matter how much money you're making, right? It doesn't matter how prestigious your title is or what companies you have on your resume. If your body isn't working right, if it's shutting down, if you're finding yourself waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning every Sunday, terrified to go to work, if every time you open your inbox, your nervous system lights up and you get upset about the possibility of having to have a conversation with your leader or your manager, that is an opportunity to take some reflection and to perhaps get some support, whether that's for a therapist or a mentor or a coach or something along those lines.
How does one differentiate between a therapist and a coach? I think this is the first time on the podcast we're bringing in a coach, so it would be like a good question.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a really good question. And there's a lot of different definitions of it, but I think the way I like to describe it is a therapist is really going to help you unwind the past, unwind how you got to where you are now, right? So it's like, what are the things that happened in childhood? What are the traumatic experiences that you may have had? What are the mindsets and ways of thinking that have kind of accumulated to the point that you're here in this moment right now? Therapy is great. I'm a huge proponent of it. I've gone to therapy for myself for years and years. I've also gone to couples therapy before, which sometimes people are like, oh, couples therapy, something must be wrong. It's like, no. I'm actually approaching this as a preventative measure. I want to make sure that we have the healthy relationship that I want to have with my partner. And I encourage people, if they haven't yet been with a therapist, to check it out. It's a lot like dating. It requires, much similar with coaching. It requires finding the right fit, finding the right therapist that really works well with that person, that there's rapport there, and that there's expertise in the right areas for what that person needs. But at some point, therapy isn't always going to be enough. And what I think about with coaching as opposed to therapy is where therapy kind of helps you figure out how you got to where you're at. Coaching really helps you figure out where you are now and where you're going in the future and how to get there. So we do a lot of work in the beginning of figuring out like, okay, like what is your current experience? How do you view the world? What are the frameworks that you're using to describe the world around you? Where do you want to be in the near future? What are the skills that you need to get there? What are the new ways of thinking that you need to approach in order to be able to achieve that vision for yourself? And then doing a lot of inner exploration. So figuring out, like I mentioned before, like what are your values? How do your values show up in your behaviors? Same thing with core beliefs. Like what are the stories you tell yourself about the way things are supposed to be? How is that helping you or hindering you? What is your mindset like? And do you have goals? A lot of people, they just don't have goals. Their goal is make money, stay employed. And those aren't goals, right? those are stop gaps, So we'll do a little bit of work to kind of figure out, like, okay, like, well, what would an attainable goal look like for you, and how do we create an environment where you can experiment and have that compassion and accountability, so that if you feel like maybe it's going to be a little too hard to do on your own, or you're a little uncertain about moving into the unknown, then you've got somebody right there in your back pocket to support you.
Nice. Okay. That's a great explanation for therapy versus coaching. I think let's talk a bit about mindfulness. I know that you said you're a facilitator and you've practiced for a while. It would be great to get your take as a coach on mindfulness and how people in tech could make use of it.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I honestly, like, mindfulness and meditation has been one of the biggest superpowers that I have gained in the last 20 years. I dabbled with meditation and mindfulness when I was in my teens and 20s. I was involved in the Zen Buddhist Center in Brooklyn, New York, and then eventually the Shambhala Buddhist Center, which is more insight meditation in New York, for a few years. But I wasn't really taking it seriously as part of an everyday practice. And it wasn't until I started hitting burnout the first time. I've actually had it 3 times. The first round of burnout, I reached in an emergency when I felt like I was having a panic attack and having a heart attack. Actually, I wasn't having a heart attack. I thought I was, on a hotel room floor, thousands of miles away from home on a business trip. Went to YouTube, as we all do, and searched for, like, panic attack help, and came up with this mindfulness meditation by Pema Chodron, which was incredibly helpful for me. It allowed me to kind of center myself. It allowed me to slow my nervous system down. And it was after that that I started to realize that there is a very powerful tool here that I'm not taking advantage of. So I started to get more involved with meditation and mindfulness community at the company that I worked at, and started to integrate it more into my day-to-day practice. And it started very, very simply with noticing and building an awareness of how my body reacted and how my nervous system reacted in different situations. Now we have things like fitness trackers and all these other tools that we can look at. And there's this interesting correlation that I noticed where it was like every time I went to have a 101 meeting with my manager, my heart rate would spike and it would stay up for a very long time as if I was running at a full pace, even though I was just sitting on a Zoom call, right? Things like this, building awareness around like, well, what happens when at the end of the day, here it is 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're supposed to be done with work. What are the stories that come up for you? Oh, I should just do this one more email, or oh, I should just keep working on this project until it's done, or I'll put off going to the gym, or I'll put off self-care until I do this piece of work. And just noticing how over time these behaviors become habits, and these habits become structured ways that you live that are keeping you stuck in place. So this mindfulness practice is really built around awareness. And there's little techniques and practices that you can do. One in particular that I like to deploy, I would call an arrival practice. And it's very, very simple. It doesn't require an enormous amount of time, but we could even just do it right here if we wanted to. Like within the space of a few deep breaths, you simply check in with yourself and notice, okay, what is the mood that's present? Can I name it? Right? Is it excited? Is it depressed? Is it fearful? If I can't put a name to that feeling, is there a feeling tone that's present? And what I mean by a feeling tone, it's like positive, negative, or neutral. Sometimes that's as far as we can go. We can only start there. It's like, okay, well, I feel pretty neutral now. There's this feeling of like maybe anxiety here. Where in my body does that live? Get really clear about that, right? Is it in my chest? Is it in my gut? Is it in my head? And just notice, like, how does my body feel in this moment? Does it feel tense? Does it feel relaxed? How am I breathing? Am I breathing deeply? Am I breathing shallow? Am I holding my breath, which often happens to people? People tend to hold their breath quite a bit. There's a non-scientific description of the thing called email apnea, which often occurs where people tend to hold their breath while they're doing email, or they breathe very, very shallow. And that's a nervous system response, because each email that you open up, you don't necessarily know, is this something positive or something negative or something that's going to be frightening or disturbing in some way. So we tend to hold our breath almost as if we're being pursued by a predator. So body, breath, heart, how's my mood and emotions? And then what are my stories that I'm telling myself? What's the quality of my thinking right now? Am I racing mind? Am I planning mind? Is it worry mind or to-do list mind? All of this can happen just within the space of a few breaths. And I encourage people to do this before they join a call, before they hit send on an email, and in particular, before you leave your office and step out into the world and inflict whatever you're experiencing on other people. Check in with yourself. Again, it's just a way to build mindfulness, and it's a way to build awareness of what is already happening all by itself.
Yeah, you just made me do all of that. Like, I just realized I changed my posture. I already started to like recount. I was starting to count my breaths.
Yeah.
So I think I just did all of that while you were talking about it.
That's great. And yeah, so like, how do you feel right now? Just being able to check in and notice those things. Like, do you notice a slightly different experience than you might have 5 minutes ago?
I mean, it totally feels different. I just realized that I was leaning forward because I was like probably a bit nervous, trying to figure out what's going on, and then I leaned back as you were asking, and I was like, oh, okay, I can calm down. It's fine.
Yeah. It's a safe space. Yeah. And again, I mean, this is exactly the idea behind these practices, is to allow your nervous system to settle, to let go of what was, to arrive to what is. And what I love to also encourage people to do is to set a little bit of an intention for what's to come next. Well, how would I like to show up next? Well, I'd like to show up calm and kind and compassionate. So let me find ways of putting that into my day and practicing that.
That's awesome. All right. I'm already loving this episode, but yeah, I think we just have probably the last question for you. But before that, do you have any other advice or things for people in tech before I move on to the work you're doing today and Changing Collective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just generally speaking, tech can be a very fast-paced and very high-demand environment. And I think a lot of times when I talk to people, they don't necessarily have a clear picture of what that's going to look like, particularly people that just come right out of university. They're just not prepared. And I think the most important thing that you can do is to talk to other people that have been in those companies and have been in those teams. Try to just network as much as you can. I think this is one thing that I always wished I had done more of when I first started out, was like meet people, build relationships with people. Your network is your net worth. I do believe that. So as you move through your tech career, if you find yourself in a team that's unfavorable, or if you find yourself in a role that isn't a really good fit, the first thing that we should be doing is we should be looking out to our network and figuring out, like, okay, who else do I know? Who can I talk to? And what I often encourage people to do is ask people when you're talking to them, who else should I talk to? Who else should I connect with? And continue to foster those relationships. We tend to focus more on the titles and the roles and the opportunities. We don't focus enough on the actual people that we end up working with on a day-to-day basis. And what I have found time and time again is it's those people that I've built those long-term relationships with that have been there for me in times of crisis, or have been there for me when I needed to find a new role. So it maybe is a little counterintuitive, but focus more on your network, focus more on that sense of community and belonging. And ideally, if you're able to and you feel comfortable to, share your experience, like that inner experience that you're having, to help destigmatize those struggles that we all have, and let people know, like, look, this is normal. This is part of what it is like to be in a high pressure, high intensity environment.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask you one more question on that. You said network is what net worth. So, and you've changed so many careers. So I guess clearly you've mastered the art of networking. Do you have any tips for people for that? Like when they foster connections, to look beyond just trying to get something out of someone, but actually create a relationship. How do you do that? And what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, at the bottom of that question, I think, is like, how do we make friends, as adults?
Yeah.
It becomes a little bit difficult as we get older, or it seems to
Mhm.
be. But I think at the core of it, it's like, it's so much about authenticity and vulnerability, like really connecting one-on-one in a meaningful way with somebody else, and not from a place of transaction, right? If you go into a meeting with somebody with the intention of needing to get something from them, it's going to come out in the way that you speak. It's going to come out in the way that you engage and interact with people. And I think that's often what makes it difficult to connect with folks, because you feel as you're going in that you're needing to ask something of somebody. And maybe there's a feeling of lack of worthiness there. It's like, well, who am I to ask somebody for help? Or who am I to ask somebody for an introduction, for example? And what I like to think about it as is more as like an energetic exchange, right? So even with this podcast right now, it's like, okay, like we both have something to share. We're both trying to make a bigger difference in the world and make the world a better place. Let's have an open and connected conversation where there's no agenda. There's no talking points necessarily that we're trying to get across, but there's this desire to connect in a meaningful way. And I think you can do the same thing in DMs on LinkedIn. You can do the same thing by just like emailing a mentor or a VP at your company and say, hey, I want to learn more about what your experience is like doing the work that you're doing. Would you be interested in sharing a few minutes? I'd love to share a little bit about what my experience is. And then it's not so much about like, hey, can you give me a referral for this job? It's like you're building rapport and actually building connection with somebody in a meaningful way. That's a longer term approach. I think a lot of times people get caught up and they're like, oh man, I got to like get a bunch of referrals. I got to get people recommending me for these jobs. Start 3 months ago on building those relationships and building that network, so that when the time comes and it's like, oh, I need to look for this other job, you've already built that relationship with the person. And it's super easy to be like, hey, could you refer me for this particular role? I know you work on this department or in this team. So it just, in general, I think makes it a lot easier to connect with people when it's not through this lens of like, oh, I need to get something out of this exchange.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Those are some great pro tips. With that, last question. What is the work that you're doing today apart from being an executive coach? And tell us exciting things about the Changing Work Collective.
Well, it dovetails really closely with one another. So the work that I do mainly with my coaching is working with people stuck in unhealthy teams or who have hit a crossroads in their life, helping them find their spark and helping them find a purpose and a mission with what they're doing. It's really similar to what I'm doing over in the Changing Work Collective. What the Changing Work Collective is, it's a community of what we call conscious business leaders and conscious business practitioners who are trying to change work from the inside out. So what does that actually mean? Well, it's folks like myself, coaches and facilitators, researchers, content creators who are seeing that there's things happening within the workplace that are making it difficult for people to be healthy, making it difficult for people to have a sense of belonging, and they want to do something about that. So we've brought them together in community. We offer them connection and community with each other, networking opportunities, collaboration opportunities, amplification of their messages via our marketing channels and via other mechanisms. We offer knowledge and education, both in the form of peer to peer sharing as well as a service provider marketplace that we provide. So if you're a coach trying to build your business and you're like, who's the podcast editor that I should talk to? Or who's the web designer I should talk to? We've already done a lot of the vetting for you and put together this collection of the best and the brightest folks within the industry to help you build your business. On the other side of it, we also have business leaders. So people who are in Fortune 50 or Fortune 500 companies who have been expressing a desire to be more conscious within the ways that they operate, to regard not just the bottom line and not just profit, but the people as well. And they want to learn more about how to be more conscious in their leadership and to help create more conscious teams. And they're working with these service providers and with us to build these roadmaps and to build these next steps moving into the future of what that could look like.
That is awesome. Good luck to you, and I hope that this gets the tech companies to be a tad bit more focused on their employees and their people. So, yeah, looking forward to this journey.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and if folks are interested, they can find out more about Changing Work. You can visit changingwork.org. We have a free and a premium membership. Premium membership gives you access to a whole lot of additional perks, and we actually have a 30-day free trial. You don't have to put a credit card in until after that 30 days is over. We also have annual memberships, and pretty soon we're going to have a discount coming up depending on when this podcast launches. We'll be launching a early 2024 special for friends and family, so feel free to check that out at changingwork.org.
I also love the community. I'm a part of it, and I love the people there. So, yeah, great work. And thank you so much for this amazing podcast. I had a ton of fun.
Thanks so much. That was great to be on. And for folks that are interested, I've got a ton of free resources on my website. If you're interested to learn more about burnout, the 12 stages of burnout, the 3 types of burnout, a lot of additional frameworks that I have up there to help you navigate challenge in the workplace. You can check that out at nicholaswhitaker.com/frameworks. You can also check out my podcast, which is the Needs Improvement Podcast, and my newsletter, the Needs Improvement Newsletter. Both of those you can find at nicholaswhitaker.com.
Awesome. I'll make sure I link everything with this episode so people can get hands-on with all these amazing resources.
That'd be great. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.